The great hall was a cavern of judgmental silence. As Aria knelt on the freezing marble floor, her knees aching against the unforgiving and cold stone. Above her, Alpha King Thorne stood like a mountain of unforgiving iron, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the very light of the flickering torches. The sacred mating bond that should have been a bridge of golden light and mutual understanding was instead a heavy chain of lead dragging her spirit into the dark dirt. Moat will not have a weak, silent shadow. For a Queen Thorne thundered, his voice echoing against the high stone arches and shattering the fragile hope she had dared to hold. You are an omega of no consequence, a flicker of dust in the presence of a great storm, and Moot reject you now and forever. The words struck her with the force of an unseen hammer, leaving her breathless and hollow as the high nobles whispered and sneered behind their silk fans. As the iron-gripped guards stepped forward to drag her from the sanctuary of the palace, she realized her entire world had ended before it had even truly begun. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. Moat would love to know how far this story reaches. The transition from the velvet tapestries and warm hearths of the palace to the rotting timber and mud of the slums was a descent into a living nightmare of poverty. Aria sat on a damp wooden crate, her breath blooming in the frigid morning air like a ghost as she watched the gray sludge of the city streets churn beneath the wheels of heavy merchant carts. To be an omega in the low district was to be a phantom among phantoms, a soul meant to be ignored and eventually forgotten by the march of history. She pulled her thin wool shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders, feeling the dampness of the freezing fog seep into her skin like a persistent and heavy ache that would never leave. In the palace, she had been a servant whose silence was considered a simple virtue, but here in the shadows, her silence was a target for those who preyed on the weak. Every single day was a relentless and exhausting rhythm of survival, starting long before the first rays of the sun even touched the jagged horizon. She spent hours hauling heavy wooden buckets of gray water from the public well, her palms becoming a map of raw blisters and rough calluses that never had time to heal. The smell of the slums was a permanent and suffocating companion, a thick mixture of coal smoke, wet earth, and the sharp metallic scent of desperation. She eventually found work in a crumbling archive at the very edge of the merchant district, a place where old scrolls went to die and forgotten secrets were buried under layers of thick gray soot and dust. Her boss was a man named Silas, whose eyes were as cold as the winter rain, seeing her only as a nameless pair of hands to sort through the endless and disorganized piles of parchment. He did not care that her mind was a vast labyrinth of logic, or that she could see the hidden geometry in the way the ink dried on the page, or the mathematical precision of the scribe's hand. Aria moved through the shadows of the archive like a phantom, her presence so minimal that even the creatures scurrying in the corners seemed to ignore her existence. She ate her meager meals of hard stale bread and watered-down soup in the corner of a drafty attic, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the rotting walls. The isolation was a heavy and suffocating blanket, but it was within this profound silence that her true self began to stir and awaken. While the rest of the world looked at Mopfher and saw only a broken girl cast out by her powerful, King Aria looked at Mopf the world and saw its complex underlying structure. She saw the intricate patterns in the way the merchant ships arrived at the docks, the rhythmic timing of the city guard patrols, and the subtle shifts in the market prices that signaled coming political storms. Her mind was a fortress of observation, a sanctuary where the chaos of her life was organized into neat rows of data and logic. She missed the physical warmth of the palace hearths, but she did not miss the cruel sneers of the nobles who had looked through her as if she were made of glass and air. In the slums, she was finally free to be invisible in a way that the Golden Crown would never have allowed. She began to collect the tiny scraps of paper that fell from the sorting tables. Fragments of communication that the rest of the world deemed worthless and unimportant. To Aria, these were not just scraps of trash, they were the building blocks of a hidden and dangerous language. She spent her long nights by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, arranging the fragments on her floor and tracing the loops of the letters with a steady and focused finger. She was building a secret map of a world that Thorne thought he ruled alone, not knowing that a girl he had discarded was slowly learning the true and hidden heartbeat of his entire kingdom. Every sting of the winter cold and every ache of her hollow stomach was a lesson in resilience, a sharpening of the intellectual blade that was her mind. She was no longer waiting for a royal bond to save her. She was forging a new and powerful destiny out of the very mud, and Ash Thorne had condemned her to. She realized that the greatest power was not held in a sword or an iron throne, but in the ability to see what others chose to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, her skin kept pale, and her frame grew lean, but her eyes became sharper and more perceptive than they had ever been in the palace. She learned to read the intentions of men by the way they tied their scrolls and the urgency of their seals. She was a silent observer of the kingdom's decay, watching as greed and corruption began to seep into the foundations of Thorne's rule. She felt no pity for the man who had cast her aside, but she felt a strange and growing responsibility to the land itself. The people in the slums were suffering, and the letters she sorted often contained the orders that made their lives even harder. She began to realize that her gift was not just a curiosity, but a weapon that could be used to protect those who had no voice. The mini cliffhanger came one stormy night as she reached under her straw mattress and pulled out a stolen raven scroll that bore a heavy black seal. She had never seen before a symbol that looked like a serpent devouring its tail, and as she broke the wax, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind outside. The crumbling archives were a maze of decaying history, where the air was thick with the scent of ancient cedar and the dry, sharp tang of old ink. Aria sat at a heavy and scarred wooden table. Her fingers stained a permanent charcoal gray from the endless task of sorting through the discarded correspondence of a kingdom that had forgotten her name. The messenger station was the beating heart of Thorne's communication network, but it was a heart that suffered from neglect and the arrogance of the high officials who managed it. They saw the scrolls as simple paper and the messages as mere words, but to Aria, they were a complex and living tapestry of data. She worked in the dim light of a high, narrow window, watching the dust motes dance in the pale afternoon sun as she carefully unrolled a batch of merchant ledgers and minor military reports. Her mind was a fortress of quiet observation, moving with a speed and precision that would have terrified those who considered her a simple Omega servant. She did not just read the words on the page, she saw the mathematical rhythm behind them. She noticed the way a certain scribe's hand would tremble slightly when recording the grain shipments to the northern border, indicating a hidden fear or a secret bribe. She tracked the frequency of certain symbols across different regions, realizing that a simple drawing of a wheat sheaf in a southern letter was actually a coded signal for a troop movement in the east. Her hidden gift was a form of vision that went beyond the physical world, allowing her to see the invisible threads of intent that bound the kingdom together. She would spend hours staring at a pile of seemingly random fragments, arranging them and rearranging them until a clear and undeniable pattern emerged from the chaos. It was like solving a puzzle that the rest of the world did not even know existed. Silas, the station master, would often stomp past her, his heavy boots echoing on the floor as he barked orders for her to work faster. He saw a girl who was slow and methodical, but he did not realize she was performing complex mental calculations that his best strategists could not conceive of. Aria kept her eyes down and her lips sealed, using her silence as a shield to protect the vast library of secrets she was building within her soul. The work was physically exhausting, and her eyes often ached from the strain of reading by candlelight. But the intellectual stimulations was the only thing keeping her spirit from shattering. She felt a strange and growing sense of power as she realized she kept more about the state of the realm than the Alpha King himself. Thorne sat on his high throne surrounded by advisors, who told him only what he wanted to hear, while Aria sat in the dirt and saw the truth of his crumbling borders and the rising tide of internal betrayal. One afternoon, a shipment of scrolls arrived from the furthest reaches of the Western Territory, bearing the official seals of the High Lords. Among the regular diplomatic letters, Aria found a small and unassuming cylinder wrapped in cheap common leather. It had no official mark, only a subtle indentation in the wax that looked like a serpent devouring its own tail. Most would have thrown it into the waste bin, but Aria felt a sudden and sharp prickle of intuition at the base of her neck. She set it aside, her heart drumming a steady rhythm against her ribs. When the station was finally quiet, and the other workers had retreated to their homes, she carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was thin and brittle, covered in a series of strange non-linear symbols that looked more like a musical score than a letter. To anyone else it was gibberish, but to Aria it was a challenge. She spent the entire night tracing the loops and lines, her mind working through hundreds of possible ciphers. She cross-referenced the symbols with the merchant codes she had memorized and the military shorthand she had intercepted weeks before. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the meaning finally clicked into place with a terrifying clarity. It was not a message about trade or taxes. It was a highly detailed and precise schedule of the Royal Guard's rotation at the upcoming Midwinter Festival. It was a map of the King's vulnerabilities, a blueprint for an event that would change the course of history. Aria realized that the Serpent Seal was the mark of a shadow organization operating within the very heart of the palace. The realization was a heavy weight that settled in the pit of her stomach. She looked at her small stained hands, and then at the dark silhouette of the royal citadel in the distance. She was a rejected outcast, living in the mud, and the Alpha King was a man who had treated her with nothing but cold disdain. She had every reason to let the plot unfold and watch his world burn. But as she looked at the decoded message, she saw more than just Thorne's life on the line. She saw the faces of the families in the slums who would be the first to suffer in the chaos of a civil war. She saw the children who would lose their homes, and the elders who would have no one to protect them. Her silence had always been her survival, but it felt like a heavy and dangerous burden. She tucked the decoded parchment into the lining of her boot, feeling the sharp edge of the paper against her skin as a constant reminder of the choice she had to make. She was no longer just a servant. She was the only person in the entire kingdom who knew the true face of the coming storm. The mini cliffhanger came as she heard a heavy and unfamiliar knock on the station door, and as she looked through the peephole, she saw the gleaming dark armor of a royal inquisitor standing in the rain. The memory of her childhood was a landscape of cold gray mist and the heavy sound of a door being locked from the outside. Aria stood by the small window of her attic room, watching the rain wash over the jagged rooftops of the slums, and felt the old familiar ache of being unwanted rise in her chest like a cold tide. She had been born into a family of minor nobles who valued strength and loud, booming voices above all else. Her father was an alpha who measured worth in the weight of a sword, and her mother was a woman who navigated the court with a sharp and biting wit. Aria had been the anomaly, a child who did not speak until she was 4 years old, and even then her words were sparse and carefully chosen. They had seen her silence as a defect, a sign of a weak and broken mind that would bring only shame to their lineage. She remembered standing in the grand library of her family home, her small hands tracing the spines of books she was too supposed to read, while her father's voice echoed through the hallway. He had been discussing her future with a cold, clinical detachment that had carved deep scars into her young heart. He had spoken of her as a liability, a burden that needed to be managed or hidden away, so as not to ruin her sister's chances for a high-status marriage. The trauma of being invisible in her own home had taught her that her thoughts were the only sanctuary she would ever truly own. She had learned to hide her intelligence to mask, the way she could solve complex equations in her head before her tutors had even finished writing them on the slate. She had watched as her family celebrated the loud and the aggressive, while she moved through the shadows like a ghost, perfecting the art of being forgotten. This early rejection had been the foundation of her resilience, but it had also planted a deep and persistent fear of ever being truly seen. When the mating bond had manifested and linked her to the Alpha King Thorne, she had felt a brief and foolish spark of hope that perhaps the universe had finally seen her value. She had imagined that a king would surely possess the wisdom to see past her quiet exterior and recognize the fire burning within her mind. But the rejection at the ceremony had been a far more public and devastating echo of her father's coldness. Thorne had not just rejected her hand, he had rejected her soul before the eyes of the entire world. He had looked at Moat Fever and seen a hollow vessel, a girl with no spirit and no strength. That moment in the Great Hall had confirmed her deepest and darkest fear that she was a mistake in a world built for the powerful. Aria leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging the pain. She remembered the way the guards had laughed as they escorted her to the city gates, and the way the common people had drawn back their skirts as if her presence were a contagion. The trauma was not just in the words of rejection, but in the total and absolute erasure of her identity. She had spent the first weeks in the slums, in a state of near catatonic shock, waiting for a voice to tell her where to go or what to do, but there was only the wind and the hunger. She had to learn to build herself from nothing, to turn her silence from a sign of weakness into a sharp and observant weapon. She realized that her fear of being seen was actually her greatest protection. If the world thought she was nothing, they would never suspect the power she held. She thought about Thorne and the way his golden eyes had burned with a mixture of pity and disgust. He thought he was a master of his domain, but he was blind to the very things that would lead to his downfall. Aria gripped the edge of the wooden sill, her knuckles turning white. The fear was still there, a small and shivering thing in the corner of her mind, but it was being slowly overtaken by a cold and steady resolve. She would not save Thorne because she wanted his love or his throne. She would save him because she was the only one who could, and because she refused to be the victim of a history written by men who were too blind to see the truth. The trauma of her past was the forge that had tempered her, and the rejection of her king was the final strike that had made her unbreakable. She looked down at the parchment hidden in her boot, feeling the weight of the secret she carried. The little girl who had been locked in a cold room was gone, and in her place was a woman who could decode the very fabric of the world. The mini cliffhanger arrived as she noticed a group of hooded men standing at the end of her alleyway, their eyes fixed on her high window. With a predatory and focused intensity, the heavy leather cylinder sat on the scarred surface of Aria's wooden table. Its presence, a silent scream in the oppressive quiet of the archive. She reached out her fingers, trembling slightly, as they brushed the cool, dark leather that held the weight of a kingdom's fate. Outside, the rain had turned into a rhythmic, steady drumming against the slate tiles of the roof, a sound that usually brought her peace, but tonight it felt like a countdown. She carefully unrolled the thin and brittle parchment. It felt like dry skin beneath her touch. The symbols were a chaotic dance of ink, a jagged landscape of non-linear codes that would have broken a lesser mind. But Aria was not a lesser mind. She was a fortress of logic and observation. She pulled her single flickering tallow candle closer, the flame dancing in the draft and casting long shifting shadows that looked like grasping fingers on the damp stone walls. Her mind began to move with the speed of a silent hawk circling the data and looking for the point of entry. She started by identifying the frequency of the repeated glyphs. The serpent seal had indicated a shadow network, but the cipher itself was a masterpiece of mathematical deception. It used a shifting base, a pattern that changed every 3 lines, like the movement of the tide. Aria closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the entire grid of the kingdom's history and the various dialects she had studied in the dusty corners of the royal library. She began to write on a scrap of gray paper, her movements fluid and precise. She was not just translating words, she was uncovering an intent. The first layer was a simple merchant code for iron and grain, but beneath it lay a second, more complex layer of military shorthand. And beneath that, the deepest level, was a specific set of coordinates and dates. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the message began to solidify into a terrifying reality. It was a planned strike on the northern supply lines, a coordinated attack designed to starve Thorne's army before the winter set in.
The precision of the timing was intense.
They knew exactly when the guards would be changing and which mountain passes would be left unprotected. Aria felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. This was not the work of a foreign enemy, it was a betrayal from within. Only someone with deep access to the royal logistics could have provided this level of detail. She looked at her small, stained hands and felt a sudden and profound sense of responsibility. She was a girl who had been thrown away a phantom in the mud, but she was the only one who could see the invisible threads of this web. She spent the next several hours refining the translation, ensuring every nuance and every timing was perfect. She felt a strange and new kind of power pulsing in her veins. Thorne had rejected her because he thought she had nothing to offer his reign, but here in the silence and the dark she was holding the key to his survival. She thought about the soldiers who would be caught in the ambush and the families who would lose their fathers. She thought about the hardship that would follow a broken border and the suffering of the innocents. Her silence was no longer a shield, it was a potential weapon of neglect. She had to act, even if the man who wore the crown did not deserve her protection. She began to draft a warning, her mind working through the best way to present the information without revealing her identity. She knew that a simple letter would likely be ignored or destroyed by the very traitors she was trying to expose. She needed a way to make the truth undeniable. She looked at Motfi the serpent seal again and realized that she could use their own language against them. She would create a counter-cipher, a message that looked like a continuation of their plot but contained the seeds of its own discovery. The intellectual effort was exhausting, leaving her lightheaded and damp with sweat, but she pushed through the fatigue. She was Aria, the silent watcher, and she was finally starting to find her voice. The mini cliffhanger came as the final word of the translation revealed the name of the traitorous noble. And as she read it, she heard a heavy thud in the alleyway below, followed by the sharp metallic clinking of approaching soldiers. The morning mist was a thick and gray shroud as Aria moved through the narrow, winding streets of the lower district. Her hood pulled low to hide her face, she felt like a phantom. Secret that was heavier than any lead weight. In her pocket was the carefully crafted warning, a message written in a hand that did not resemble her own and sealed with a generic merchant mark. She knew the path to the palace gates was a dangerous journey for someone of her status, but the urgency in her soul was a driving force that she could not ignore. She arrived at the high stone walls of the citadel, watching the elite guards in their gleaming dark armor. As they stood like statues of iron, they looked down at the common people with a mixture of boredom and disdain, and Aria felt the old familiar sting of her rejection. She knew that if she approached them directly, she would be driven away or, worse, imprisoned for questioning. She had to be clever. She watched the merchant carts entering the secondary service entrance, where the inspections were more about taxes than security. She waited for a cart, carrying heavy barrels of winter cider, a shipment that was destined for the officers' mess hall. As the cart slowed for a turning, Aria moved with the grace of a shadow, tucking her message into the leather binding, a barrel where a curious officer would be sure to find it. She pulled back into the shadows, her heart racing as she watched the cart disappear through the iron portcullis. She had done her part, and now she could only hope that someone in that fortress possessed the intelligence to read the warning. She spent the rest of the day in a state of hot tension, her mind constantly replaying the decoded coordinates and the timing of the coming strike. She returned to the archives and tried to focus on her work, but the scrolls felt like meaningless paper compared to the living history she was trying to change. Silas barked at her for being distracted, and she accepted his insults with her usual silence, using the verbal abuse as a mask for her internal turmoil. Days passed, and the tension in her chest only grew. She watched the city for any sign of movement, but the royal court seemed to be continuing its decadent and blind routines. She began to hear rumors in the market of Thorne, preparing for a grand hunting party, a display of power and leisure, while the northern border was a ticking clock. Aria felt a deep and burning frustration. Her warning had been sent, but was it being read, or was it sitting in a pile of discarded trash like she once was? She realized that the arrogance of the powerful was a far more dangerous enemy than the shadow organization itself. They could not imagine that a threat could be predicted by anyone outside their inner circle of advisors. She began to formulate a second, more direct plan. She would not rely on the systems that had failed her. She would find a way to reach Thorne himself. She knew his schedule from the intercepted guard rotations, and she knew the secret passages that the servants used to move between the kitchens and the feasting halls. She felt a wave of fear at the thought of returning to the place of her humiliation, but her resolve was a cold and steady blade. She was no longer the broken girl who had knelt on the marble floor. She was the architect of a silent defense. She spent her nights studying the palace layouts she had memorized years ago, looking for the one point where she could plant the evidence of the betrayal in a way that Thorne could not ignore. She realized that she was becoming a guardian of the kingdom that had cast her out, a role that was as poetic as it was dangerous. She felt a strange and distant connection to the Alpha King, a bond that was no longer about romance, but about a shared destiny. He was the sword, and she was the mind, and the sword would shatter without the logic to guide it. The mini cliffhanger arrived when she found a small hidden mark on the underside of a merchant table in the archive, a fresh serpent seal that indicated the traitors were moving their deadline up to tonight. The icy wind of the northern mountain pass bit through the heavy fur lining of Thorne's royal cloak, but the Alpha King barely felt the chill as he sat atop his massive charcoal steed. His golden eyes were fixed on the jagged horizon, where the gray sky met the unforgiving stone of the frost peaks. He was a man built for battle, a commander who had never known the sting of a true tactical defeat, and his confidence was a heavy iron shield that protected him from the doubts of his advisors. In his gauntleted hand, he crushed a piece of J-Hot-E-A-Pay parchment, a warning he had dismissed as the ramblings of a fearful peasant or a clumsy attempt at deception. The letter had predicted an attack at this exact location, off this exact hour. But Thorne had looked off the terrain and seen only a deserted wasteland. He believed in the strength of his legions and the sharp edge of his own intuition more than the anonymous whispers of a shadow. Behind him, his elite cavalry waited in a disciplined silence, their armor clinking softly as the horses shifted in the deepening snow. The air was thick, with the scent of pine and frozen earth, a stillness that Thorne misinterpreted as security. He gave the signal to advance, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the canyon walls. As the column of soldiers moved into the narrowest part of the pass, the silence was suddenly shattered not by the roar of an army, but by the rhythmic thumping of heavy logs being released from the heights. The trap was a masterpiece of gravity and timing. Massive stones and timber cascaded down the slopes, creating a barrier of dust and debris that cut the royal vanguard off from the main force.
You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story.
Thorne's horse reared its eyes wide with a natural and healthy instinct for self-preservation, as the king struggled to maintain control. From the shadows of the caves above, arrows began to rain down with a terrifying and mathematical precision. They did not aim for the heart, they aimed for the gaps in the armor and the joints of the horse's tack. Thorne realized with a sudden and sickening jolt of clarity that the anonymous warning had been correct down to the second. His pride had led his men into a bottleneck where their superior numbers were a liability instead of an asset. He fought with a desperate and focused intensity, his blade a blur of silver as he parried the incoming projectiles. But he could feel the tide of the skirmish turning against him. The attackers were not common bandits, they were a coordinated unit that moved with the fluid grace of professional assassins. Every move they made seemed to anticipate his own, as if they had read his military manuals and knew his every reflex. Thorne felt a surge of cold fury at his own arrogance. He had been so convinced of his own legend that he had ignored the voice of the truth. He watched as his loyal guards were forced into a defensive circle, their shields overlapping to form a fragile dome against the onslaught. The noise was a chaotic symphony of shouting and the sharp metallic ring of steel against steel. Thorne's mind raced as he tried to find an escape route, but the canyon was a stone cage. He saw his lead general fall, not from a mortal wound, but from a dart that sent him into a deep and unnatural sleep. The strategy was clear. They wanted to capture the leadership and leave the army headless. As the sun began to set, casting long and bloody shadows across the snow, Thorne realized that the only reason he was still standing was because the enemy was playing a game of cat and mouse. He managed to rally a small group of riders and lead a frantic charge toward the rear of the pass, using the cover of a rising snowstorm to break through the blockade. The retreat was a bitter and humiliating crawl back to the safety of the lower fortresses. Thorne sat in his tent that night, the golden glow of the lanterns mocking the darkness of his mood. He looked at the crumpled parchment on the table, seeing the elegant and logical loops of the handwriting with new eyes. This was not the work of a fool. This was the work of a genius who saw the world in a way he could not. He felt a strange and painful pull in his chest, a resonance of the mating bond he had tried to bury under years of cold duty. He thought of Aria, the silent girl he had cast into the mud, and a terrifying thought began to take root in his mind. What if the person he had rejected was the only person who could save his kingdom from the rot growing within its own heart? He realized that the Shadow Organization was already inside his walls, and he was fighting an enemy that knew his every thought. The mini cliffhanger came when he summoned his master of spies and ordered him to find the source of the letter, even if it meant searching every hovel in the slums. And the spy whispered that the handwriting matched the ancient records of a family he had banished years ago. The slums were a labyrinth of wet wood and the heavy scent of coal smoke as Thorne moved through the crowded alleys, his royal presence hidden beneath a tattered gray wool cloak. He had spent his entire life in the high halls of power, looking down at the city, as if it were a game board, but now the board was looking back at him with eyes full of hunger and suspicion. The air was thick with the fog of a coming winter, and the ground was a treacherous soup of mud and frozen slush. Thorne felt a profound sense of displacement as he passed the hovels, where entire families huddled for warmth, their voices hushed as the tall stranger moved past. He was searching for the archive station, a place he had never visited and barely knew existed. He felt the weight of his own failure pressing on his shoulders, a physical burden that made his broad frame seem to sag. The memory of the ambush in the mountain pass was a fresh and stinging wound, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the elegant script of the anonymous warning. He arrived at the archive station, a leaning structure of gray timber that looked as if a strong wind would topple it into the gutter. Inside, the air was dry and sharp, with the smell of old parchment and the metallic tang of cheap ink. Thorne stood in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of a few sputtering candles. He saw several workers bent over heavy tables, their hands stained vekep-tahat chalk, and their backs curved from years of labor. In the furthest corner, a small figure was working with a focus that seemed to create a vacuum of silence around her. It was Aria, although Thorne did not recognize the girl he had once humiliated. Her hair, which had once been styled in elaborate royal braids, was now pulled back in a practical and messy knot, and her skin was pale and smudged with soot. She looked fragile, like a bird caught in a storm, but there was an intensity in her posture that commanded respect. Thorne approached the counter, his movements careful and slow. He did not want to draw attention to his alpha scent or his warrior-s stride. He spoke to the station master, Silas, his voice a low and controlled rasp as he asked about the recent shipments of military scrolls. Silas looked at Mof, the gold coin Thorne placed on the wood, and his eyes lit up with greed, but he shook his head, claiming to know nothing of any secret messages. As they spoke, Aria didn't look up, but her fingers paused for a fraction of a second over the scroll she was sorting. Thorne's intuition flared. He walked toward her corner, his heavy boots echoing on the creaking floorboards. He stood behind her for a long moment, watching as she arranged a series of small paper fragments into a complex grid. He saw the logic of her movements, the way she didn't just move the pieces, but calculated their position, with a speed that was almost impossible to follow. He felt a sudden and sharp jolt of recognition, not of her face, but of her mind. This was the same logic he had seen in the warning letter. He reached out a hand to touch the table, but Aria suddenly swept the fragments into a pile and stood up. Her head bowed and her shoulders tense. "Moat, am just a sorter, sir," she whispered, her voice a dry and hollow echo of the one he had heard in the great hall. "There is nothing here for a man of your station." Thorne felt the mating bond flare into a white-hot intensity, a bridge of fire that connected his soul to hers with a force that nearly brought him to his knees. He looked at the side of her face, seeing the sharp line of her jaw and the quiet resilience in her eyes. He wanted to reach out and pull back her hood to see the face of the person who had saved his life, but he was paralyzed by a sudden and overwhelming sense of shame. He realized that if he revealed himself now, she would see him as the monster who had discarded her when she was at her most vulnerable. He watched as she turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the back room, her movements fluid and silent. Thorne stood alone in the archive, the scent of her skin, a mixture of lavender and old paper, lingering in the air like a ghost. He looked down at the table and saw that she had left a single fragment behind a piece of paper with a serpent seal that had been crossed out with a single bold stroke of ink. He realized that she was not just watching the shadows, she was fighting them. The mini cliffhanger arrived as Thorne stepped out into the rain and was immediately surrounded by 4 men in dark leather armor, their faces hidden by serpent masks and their hands resting on the hilts of their concealed blades. Aria stood by the high and narrow window of the archive attic, her fingers gripping the rough and splintered wood of the sill until her knuckles turned a stark and ghostly white. Below, in the rain-slicked labyrinth of the alleyway, the 4 men in serpent masks moved with a synchronized and predatory grace, their shadows stretching and twisting like ink in the gutter water. Thorne stood at the center of their tightening circle, his tall and broad frame a mountain of silent defiance, even beneath the humble gray wool of his commoner-s cloak. Aria could feel the mating bond between them beginning to pulse with a low and rhythmic thrum, like a drum beating in the deep and lightless distance. It was a sensation she had tried to drown in the cold and gray reality of her exile, but now it was rising like a frantic tide. She watched as the leader of the masked men, shifted his weight, and she saw the glint of a thin and wicked blade hidden in the folds of his leather sleeve. Her mind, which usually moved through the cold and steady logic of numbers and ciphers, was suddenly a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. She remembered the absolute and crushing weight of Thorne's rejection in the great hall and the way his voice had sounded like a falling mountain as he proclaimed her worthless. She remembered the sneers of the nobles and the cold sting of the palace floors against her knees. Part of her soul ached with a dark and bitter desire to simply turn away and let the shadows claim the man who had discarded her like a broken tool. He had called her a shadow, and perhaps it was only justice that he be swallowed by them. But as she watched the masked men prepare to move, her logic began to override her resentment. She saw the pattern of their formation and realized they were not just seeking a capture. They were positioned for a final and absolute erasure. If Thorne died tonight, the kingdom would crumble into a civil war that would turn the slums into a graveyard, and the innocent would be the first to burn in the fires of the coming anarchy. She saw the specific way the nearest attacker was, watching Thorne's left side, and she knew from her decoded military maps that Thorne had a slight and lingering weakness in his left shoulder from a campaign years ago. The conspirators knew his every vulnerability, and they were using his own history as a weapon against him. Aria realized that she could not let him fall, not because he was her king or her mate, but because he was the only thing standing between the people she lived with and total destruction. She moved with a sudden and quiet desperation, scanning her small room for anything that could serve as a distraction. She saw the heavy metal lantern hanging from the ceiling beam, and the series of pulleys she had rigged to move her heavy crates of scrolls. With a precision born of years of silent observation, she calculated the angle of the drop and the timing of the alleyway's echo. She reached for the rope and pulled it with a steady and focused strength. The heavy lantern crashed onto the stone pavement, 3 houses away from Thorne's location, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the narrow space. The masked men flinched for a fraction of a second, their focus splintering as they turned toward the sudden noise. In that tiny and precious window of opportunity, Thorne moved with the speed of a striking hawk, his own blade clearing his cloak in a blur of silver. He did not aim to kill but to disable, moving through their ranks with a tactical efficiency that was both terrifying and beautiful to behold. Aria watched as he broke through their circle, using the distraction to vanish into the deep and fog-filled shadows of a connecting tunnel. She pulled back from the window, her breath coming in ragged and shaky exhales. She had saved him, but he would never know. She felt a profound and heavy sense of irony as she realized the man who called her invisible had been saved by a ghost. She sank to the floor, her back against the damp stone wall, feeling the bond slowly settle back into a dull and persistent ache. She was terrified of the power she held, and even more terrified of the fact that the bond was still alive and screaming for a man who did not know her name. The mini cliffhanger arrived as she noticed a single drop of royal crimson blood on her windowsill, and realized that in his escape, Thorne Mauete have brushed against the very wall of her sanctuary. Thorne sat in the corner of a dimly lit and abandoned warehouse at the edge of the merchant district, his breath finally steadying as he pressed a clean piece of linen against a shallow graze on his forearm. The air was cold and smelled of old timber and the distant salt of the sea, but his mind was far away in the archives he had just fled. He could still feel the phantom heat of the mating bond on his skin, a sensation so intense it had felt like a physical touch in the middle of the skirmish. He had been surrounded and outmatched, but the sudden crash of the lantern had been too perfect to be an accident. It had been a tactical intervention, a piece of timing so precise it felt like the work of a master strategist. He reached into the inner pocket of his tunic and pulled out the single fragment of paper he had snatched from the sorting table before the girl had swept them away. He held it close to the flickering light of a small candle, his fingers tracing the edges of the parchment, with a reverence he usually reserved for ancient royal treaties. It was a piece of a merchant ledger, but on the back in a script that was as elegant as it was logical were a series of notes that decoded the arrival times of the royal grain ships. But it wasn't just the information that made his heart hammer against his ribs, it was the handwriting. He recognized the specific loop of the letters and the way the ink was used sparingly, yet with absolute clarity. This was the same hand that had written the anonymous warning that had saved his army in the mountain pass. He looked at the fragment and then at the dark silhouette of the city, and a wave of absolute and crushing realization washed over him. The girl in the archive with the soot-stained hands and the quiet eyes was the person he had been searching for. And then, with a jolt of pain that felt like a physical blow, he realized who she actually was. He saw the sharp line of her jaw in his memory, and the way she had looked at him in the Great Hall 3 years ago. The silent Omega he had rejected because he thought she was weak and empty was the same genius who had been standing between him and his enemies for months. The woman he had cast into the mud was the architect of his survival. Thorne felt a surge of hoy-hunt so deep and so heavy it threatened to suffocate him. He had treated her like dust beneath his boots, while she had been the shield he never knew he had. He thought of her pale face and her thin shoulders, and he realized that while he had been living in the luxury of the palace, she had been surviving in the shadows she had saved him from. He looked at the fragment, again seeing the way she had crossed out the serpent seal with a single bold and defiant stroke. She knew about the conspiracy, and she was fighting it from a position of absolute vulnerability. He felt a desperate and driving need to go back to find her and to beg for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. But he also knew that he had already destroyed the bridge between them. He had publicly humiliated her and stripped her of her dignity, and his presence now would likely feel like another form of persecution. He realized that she had been protecting the kingdom while he had been failing it, and the irony was a bitter poison in his mouth. He was the king, but she was the true leader. He spent the rest of the night staring at the fragment, his mind replaying every cruel word he had ever spoken to her. He began to see the logic of her silence. She hadn't been empty. She had been waiting and observing and learning. She was the mind that his sword desperately needed, and he had thrown her away because he was too arrogant to see past her status. The mini cliffhanger came as he noticed a hidden watermark on the fragment when held to the light, a mark that was not from a merchant house, but was the secret seal of the royal treasury, indicating the traitors were closer to his throne than he ever imagined. The archives felt smaller and more oppressive than usual as Aria hunched over the massive leather-bound ledger, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers with a feverish and intense focus. The smell of decaying vellum and stale, dry air was thick in the room, but she barely noticed the physical discomfort of the cramped and dusty attic. Her mind was a high-speed engine of pure logic, processing the data of the royal treasury records she had managed to obtain through a sympathetic and quiet clerk in the merchant district. She was looking for a specific frequency of withdrawals, a pattern that matched the timing of the shadow movements she had been tracking for months across the eastern border. As the moonlight began to spill across her scratched wooden desk in cold silver bars, the numbers suddenly aligned into a terrifying and undeniable truth that made her heart stop for a heartbeat. The funds were not being moved for military supplies or public works, as the official seals suggested. They were being funneled into a series of offshore merchant accounts that all led back to a single powerful Lord Harkin, the High Chancellor, and Thorne, his most trusted advisor. Aria felt a sharp and freezing jolt of shock that made her fingers go numb against the paper. Harkin was the man who had stood directly beside Thorne during the rejection ceremony, the man who had whispered poisonous words into the king's ear as he sent her into the mud and the rain. He was the one who had encouraged the king's arrogance and fueled his disdain for the omegas of the realm. Aria saw the mathematical proof of a multi-year embezzlement scheme designed to weaken the royal defenses while building a private army of professional mercenaries. The serpent seal she had found earlier was not just a symbol of a shadow gang's, it was Harkon's private family crest hidden in plain sight. She realized that every decision Thorne had made for the last year had been subtly manipulated and directed to bring him to this exact moment of total vulnerability. The logic was elegant and chilling, a slow-motion collapse of a kingdom orchestrated by its second most powerful man. Aria looked at the name written in the ledger, feeling the weight of the secrecy pressing on her soul like a mountain of iron. She was a girl in the dirt, and she was holding the death warrant of the Alpha King. She thought about the consequences of revealing the truth to a world that had already decided she was nothing. If she came forward, she would be entering a den of vipers where her word would be worth nothing against the massive influence of a chancellor. But if she stayed silent, she would be complicit in the murder of a man who was still her fated mate. Despite the coldness of his past heart, she saw the pattern of the betrayal expanding, to include the palace guard and the royal scouts. Thorne was standing on a floor of thin glass, and Harkon was ready to shatter it with a single stroke. She realized that Harkon had been the one who ensured she was cast out, knowing that her sharp mind might be the only thing capable of seeing through his complex web of lies. Her rejection was not just a matter of status, it was a strategic move to eliminate a witness. She felt a surge of cold fury at the depth of the manipulation. The mini cliffhanger came as she heard a familiar and cold voice from the doorway of the archive, asking Silas where the silent girl was hiding her secrets, and she realized the Chancellor's men had finally traced the missing ledgers to her desk. The air in the archives was suddenly electric, with a new and immediate danger. Aria stayed perfectly still in the deep shadows, her breath shallow and silent as she listened to the conversation at the entrance. Harkon's voice was like the sound of grinding stones, a low and dangerous rumble that signaled a predator on the move. He was looking for her with a focused and predatory intensity. He had realized that a leak existed in his financial network, and his logic had led him to the only place where the kingdom's secrets were processed by the forgotten. Aria knew she had only moments to act before her sanctuary was breached. She gathered the ledger and the decoded ciphers, tucking them into the hidden inner pocket of her heavy woolen shawl. She moved with the fluid grace of a creature born to the dark, slipping through the high back window and into the freezing rain of the alleyway just as the door to the attic was kicked open. The city was a landscape of gray and black, but her mind was fixed on the single piece of information she had decoded just before the Chancellor arrived. Strike was scheduled for the midwinter banquet tonight. The location was the high terrace overlooking the royal gardens, a place where Thorne would be isolated from his main body of guards for the ceremonial lighting of the sacred hearth. Aria realized that her previous anonymous warnings had never reached the king because Harkon's men controlled the royal messenger stations. Every letter she had sent had been intercepted and destroyed before it could ever touch the king's hand. She was the only warning Thorne would ever receive. She looked up at Moth, the royal citadel, its towers piercing the stormy sky like jagged teeth of iron. The thought of returning to that place sent a wave of physical nausea through her stomach. She could still feel the cold marble against her knees and hear the echoing and cruel laughter of the nobles. Her trauma was a physical weight, a chain that tried to pull her back into the safety of the mud and the silence. But her logic was stronger than her fear. She knew that if she did not go, Thorne would die, and the kingdom would be plunged into a darkness that would never end. She spent the next few hours navigating the outskirts of the city, avoiding the main patrols and the Chancellor's scouts. She used the secret tunnels of the old aqueducts paths, known only to the outcasts and the forgotten to reach the base of the palace cliff. The rain was a relentless and heavy curtain, washing away her scent and providing cover for her movements. She felt a strange and new sense of empowerment as she climbed the ancient stone steps. She was no longer the girl who had been cast out in shame. She was the guardian of the throne. She was the mind that would outplay the Chancellor's greed. She realized that the fated bond was not a curse meant to bind her to a man who did not want her, but a responsibility to protect the soul of the realm itself. As she reached the final gate, she saw the elite guards in their ceremonial crimson, cloaks, their eyes fixed on the festive crowds and the celebration. They were completely blind to the snake in their midst. Aria pulled her hood low and prepared to cross the threshold into the lioness den. She knew that her appearance would cause a scandal, but she didn't care about her own reputation anymore. She only cared about the timing. She had to reach the terrace before the hearth was lit. The mini cliffhanger arrived. When she saw Thorne stepping onto the terrace, his golden eyes bright with a false sense of security, while a hooded figure moved silently into position, behind the heavy velvet curtains of the royal dais, holding a blade that glinted in the firelight. The royal citadel stood as a jagged crown of stone atop the massive black cliffs looming over the city like a silent and judgmental god. Aria moved through the darkness of the lower servant, tunnels her breath, a shallow and rhythmic prayer that kept her heart from shattering with fear. The air in these narrow passages was damp and smelled of ancient earth, and the heavy grease of the palace kitchens, a stark contrast to the crisp and expensive scent of the high terraces above. She was a ghost in the machine of the kingdom, her presence so minimal that the few busy kitchen workers she passed saw only a smudge of shadow in the corner of their vision. Her mind was a high-speed engine of pure calculation, mapping the movements of the elite royal guards based on the rhythmic clatter of their heavy armored boots on the floors above. She knew from her intercepted ciphers that the shift change was precisely 3 minutes away, and she used that window of opportunity to slip through the heavy oak door leading to the great feasting hall. The sudden transition from the dark and cramped tunnels to the vast and golden expanse of the hall was a physical blow to her senses. The room was a landscape of extreme luxury, filled with the shimmering glow of thousands of beeswax candles and the vibrant colors of silk and velvet tapestries. The long banquet tables were laden with silver platters of exotic fruits and heavy crystal decanters of dark red wine. The air was thick with the sounds of sophisticated laughter and the delicate tinkling of silver against fine china, a symphony of wealth that ignored the starving whispers of the slums outside. Aria felt the old and heavy weight of her public humiliation rising in her chest as she moved along the perimeter of the room, keeping her head bowed and her soot-stained hands hidden in the folds of her shawl. She was the very thing these people feared, the most a living reminder of the poverty they chose to ignore. She saw Thorne standing on the high dais at the far end of the hall, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy crimson royal cloak that seemed to catch the very light of the hearth fires. He looked powerful and untouchable, a king of iron and gold who moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Beside him sat Lord Harkin, the High Chancellor, his expression one of polite and calculated loyalty as he leaned in to whisper a joke that made the king smile. Aria felt a surge of cold and absolute fury as she looked at the man who was systematically dismantling the kingdom's future. She saw the pattern of the room, the way the secondary guards were being subtly directed toward the entrances and away from the terrace where the midwinter ceremony would take place. It was a tactical isolation, a masterpiece of betrayal that was unfolding in real time. Her inner thoughts were a chaotic storm of trauma and duty. She remembered the way Thorne had looked at her on this very floor, telling her she was nothing but dust, and for a brief and dark moment, she wanted to simply turn back and let the fire consume him. But then she looked at the faces of the young servants, in the hall, people who would be the first to lose their lives in the coming chaos, and she knew she could not walk away. Her logic was her only weapon, and her silence was her only shield. She reached the heavy velvet curtains that led to the royal terrace, her fingers gripping the fabric with a strength that made her knuckles ache. She was about to step into the light of her greatest fear to face the man who had broken her heart before the eyes of the entire world. She realized that she was no longer the girl who had knelt in shame. She was the architect of the kingdom's survival. The mini cliffhanger arrived as she felt a cold and thin hand grip her shoulder from behind, and she heard the sharp and metallic click of a dagger being unsheathed in the shadows of the curtain. The terrace was a wide and open expanse of white marble that seemed to float between the dark storm clouds and the flickering lights of the city below. King Thorne stood alone by the massive stone hearth, his golden eyes reflecting the leaping orange flames of the sacred fire. He felt a strange and persistent sense of unease, a low-frequency vibration in his soul that the mating bond was broadcasting with an intensity he could no longer ignore. He thought of the girl in the archive, her pale face and her brilliant mind, and he felt a wave of agonizing regret wash over him. He was a king who had everything, and yet he felt as hollow as a drum. Behind him, Lord Harkern approached with a silver chalice, his footsteps silent on the marble. "Your Majesty the Chancellor said, his voice smooth and steady, the hour of the lighting has arrived. The people are waiting for their signal of strength." Thorne turned his expression, a hardened mask of royal duty, but before he could reach for the chalice, the heavy velvet curtains were torn aside, and Aria stepped onto the terrace. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. She looked like a creature of the earth and the rain, her dress ragged and her skin smudged with soot, but her eyes were twin fires of absolute logic and resolve. Thorne froze his heart, hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he recognized the girl he had discarded. Harkonnens' expression shifted from polite calm to a mask of cold and murderous intent as he gestured for the guards to move in. "Arrest this interloper," he barked, his voice cracking the stillness of the night. "She is a madwoman seeking to disrupt the royal peace." But Aria didn't flinch. She stepped toward Thorne, holding up the royal treasury ledger and the decoded serpent ciphers for all to see. "Do not touch that chalice, my king," she said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing off the stone arches. "The wine is tilled with the poison of a traitor, and the man standing beside you is the one who holds the needle." The nobles who had followed them onto the terrace gasped and whispered, their silk fans fluttering like the wings of panicked moths. Harkon laughed, a dry and hollow sound that carried no warmth. "You expect the king to believe the ramblings of a discarded Omega, a girl who sorts trash for a living. Look at Her Majesty. She is a desperate soul seeking a moment of relevance." Thorne looked from Harkon to Aria, seeing the absolute clarity in her gaze. He saw the ledger in her hand and recognized the script of the anonymous guardian. He realized in a moment of blinding insight that she was not there for revenge, she was there for his survival. He pushed Harkonnens' hand away, the silver chalice clattering onto the marble and spilling a dark and bubbling liquid that hissed against the stone, indicating the presence of a powerful acid. The shock on Thorne's face was profound, a mixture of terror and absolute awe. Aria began to speak the words of the decoded ciphers, her logic weaving a tapestry of betrayal that exposed Harkonnens' every move from the embezzled funds to the troop coordinates in the mountain pass. She explained the pattern of the serpent seal and how it had been hidden in the merchant records for years. She was the shield of logic, protecting the king with the very mind he had once deemed worthless. As she finished the last of the data, the hooded figure behind the dais moved with a sudden and fluid speed, drawing a thin blade tilled with the same acid. Thorne reacted with a warrior's instinct, stepping in front of Aria and parrying the strike with his own ceremonial sword. But it was Aria's warning that had given him the precious second to move. Harkon, realizing his plan had shattered, tried to flee toward the stairs, but he was intercepted by a group of royal guards who had been watching the exchange with growing horror. The Chancellor was brought to his knees, his power evaporating in the light of Aria's truth. Thorne stood before Aria, his breath coming in ragged exhales, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He realized that he had spent his entire life looking for a queen of strength and blood, while the queen of mind and soul had been waiting in the mud. He felt a surge of shame so deep it made his knees weak. The mini cliffhanger came as Thorne slowly reached out his hand toward her, his fingers trembling, and he whispered her name for the first time in 3 years. And as Aria looked at him, she didn't see a king. She saw a man who was finally beginning to understand the true cost of his pride. The absolute silence of the terrace was a heavy and suffocating shroud, as King Thorne stood before Aria, his massive and powerful frame, trembling with a vulnerability that none of his subjects had ever witnessed. The orange glow of the sacred hearth fires danced across his battle-scarred face, casting long and shifting shadows that seemed to mimic the chaotic turmoil of his soul. He looked down, at Motfi, his own hands, the fingers that were so used to the heavy weight of a broadsword and the iron grip of a reins, and he felt a sudden and profound sense of worthlessness. He looked at Aria, seeing the thinness of her shoulders and the soot-stained skin of her hands, and the memory of his own voice thundered in his mind, telling her she was nothing but dust. The irony was a bitter and jagged glass in his throat. He had called her weak and invisible, yet she had been the only one with the strength and the vision to see the rot that was eating his kingdom alive. Aria stood her ground, her posture straight, and her gaze fixed on his face with a clarity that felt like a surgical blade. She did not look like a victim, she looked like the architect of a new world. Thorne felt the mating bond pulsing between them, a golden thread that had been frayed and battered by his own arrogance, but it was now singing with a desperate and mournful frequency. "Mut de no, to see you," he whispered, his voice breaking and sounding like the rustle of dead leaves in a winter storm. Mut looked at you, and Mut only saw what Mut wanted to see. Mut saw a girl who wouldn't speak, and Mut thought you were empty, but you were the most crowded and brilliant mind in my entire realm. Aria watched him, her inner thoughts, a complex labyrinth of logic and lingering trauma. The bond was screaming for her to reach out and comfort him, to allow the physical warmth of his presence to wash away the cold memories of the slums. But she remained still, her silence, her most powerful weapon. She remembered every freezing night in the archive attic, and every time she had to beg for a scrap of stale bread while he sat at his gilded tables. Her dignity was a fortress that she would not surrender for a few words of late regret. "You saw exactly what you were taught to see." "Thorne," she replied, her voice steady and resonant like a bell in the dark. "You were taught that power was loud and that strength was made of iron, but the true power of this kingdom is hidden in the patterns of the forgotten. You cast me into the shadows, thinking you were silencing me, but you only gave me the perfect vantage point to observe your downfall." Thorne closed his eyes, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He realized that the woman standing before him was far more than just his mate. She was his superior, in every way that truly mattered. He saw the ledger. She still held the proof of her genius and his own blindness. He felt a wave of absolute and crushing shame as he thought of how close he had come to losing everything because of his own pride. He slowly sank to one knee on the cold white marble, the same marble where she had once knelt in public humiliation. He was the king of a vast and powerful land. But in this moment, he was nothing but a man seeking mercy from a soul he had tried to break. He reached out to touch the hem of her tattered dress, his fingers hesitant and reverent. "Please," he choked out the words sounding like a prayer. "Do not go back to the shadows. Mot will spend every heartbeat of my remaining life trying to earn the right to stand in your light." Aria looked down at the crown on his head and then at the city lights below, realizing that her journey was no longer about her own survival. It was about the legacy of all those who were still invisible. The mini cliffhanger arrived as Aria stepped back from his touch, her expression unreadable, and she told him that the king did not need to earn her forgiveness, he needed to earn her respect by tearing down the very laws that had allowed his chancellor to thrive. The Great Hall was once again a cavern of golden light and hushed whispers, but the atmosphere was fundamentally changed from the night of Aria's rejection 3 years ago. The high nobles and the powerful lords stood in a wide and respectful semicircle, their silk fans stilled, and their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. King Thorne sat on his high throne of dark iron, but his eyes were not fixed on the room. He was watching Aria as she stood at the center of the hall. She was no longer wearing the tattered rags of the slums, but a simple and elegant gown of deep charcoal wool, a garment that emphasized her quiet authority rather than her status as an Omega. She held a new scroll in her hands, a document she had drafted in the silence of the royal archives during the long hours of the morning. Thorne leaned forward, his voice a low and resonant rumble that filled the vast space with a new kind of gravity. Aria, the king said, and the way he spoke her name made the air in the room vibrate with deep and earned respect. You have saved this throne from a betrayal that would have ended our line. Mort have offered you the position of queen consort to sit beside me and share in the glory of this reign. But the hall went silent as Aria slowly shook her head, her gaze never wavering from the king's golden eyes. Moot will not sit on a throne of old and broken laws, Thorne, she said, her voice clear and carrying to the furthest corners of the stone arches. Moat did not survive the slums to become a trophy or a shadow in a different kind of palace. Moat am not a consort. Moat am a strategist, and if Moat am to remain in this citadel, it will be as the High Minister of Intelligence and the architect of the new law. A collective gasp rippled through the nobles, like a wind through a field of wheat. For an Omega to demand a position of official government power was an act of defiance that challenged centuries of tradition. But Thorne did not look angry. He looked as if he was finally seeing the true shape of his destiny. He realized that Aria was not looking for a marriage, she was looking for a revolution. She was demanding that her mind be recognized as a sovereign entity, independent of the bond that linked their souls. Aria stepped forward and unrolled her scroll, her inner thoughts, a steady and focused stream of logic. She knew that the only way to prevent another Harkon from rising was to create a system of transparency and to empower those who had been kept in the dark. I demand the immediate and total abolition of the shadow laws, she declared, her finger tracing the lines of her own handwriting. I demand that every Omega in this kingdom be granted the right to education and the right to own the products of their own labor. I demand the creation of a royal archive of cryptography where the secrets of the realm are managed by those who possess the logic to understand them. Thorne looked at the nobles, seeing their discomfort and their silent resistance, but he also saw the younger generation of servants and minor clerks who were watching Aria with a flicker of new and dangerous hope. He realized that the old ways were a rotting timber, and Aria was the only one who knew how to build a new foundation. He stood up, his royal cloak swirling around his boots as he stepped down from the dais to stand on the same level as his mate. He took the scroll from her hand, his touch a silent promise of equality. Your demands are not just requests, Aria. They are the requirements for the survival of this kingdom, he said, and his voice carried a weight of absolute decree. From this day forward, the archives are no longer a place of dust and forgotten history. They are the center of our government, and you are their master. The laws will be rewritten in your hand, and the power of this throne will be guided by the logic of your mind. Aria felt a surge of profound and empowering warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth fires. She had found her voice, and she had used it to change the course of history. She looked at Thorne and saw a man who was finally beginning to understand that the greatest strength of a king was the ability to listen to the truth. The mini cliffhanger arrived as the first royal crier stepped out onto the palace balcony to announce the end of the shadow laws, and as the news reached the slums, a massive and rhythmic cheering began to rise from the dark streets, below a sound that signaled the birth of a new and unbreakable empire. The dawn light of the new era spilled through the high stained glass windows of the great hall, painting the marble floor in a vibrant and shimmering mosaic of emerald gold and sapphire. King Thorne stood at the center of the royal dais, his dark iron crown replaced by a ceremonial one of silver and obsidian, a symbol of the balanced and enlightened rule he was now pledging to his people. Beside him, Aria stood with a quiet and unwavering dignity, her presence filling the vast room with an authority that did not need a booming voice to be felt by every soul present. She wore a gown of midnight blue wool, the fabric simple but elegant, emphasizing her role as a leader of the mind rather than a trophy of the court. In her steady hands, she held the great charter of the new law, a document that she had spent the last several weeks perfecting with the same mathematical precision she had once used to decode enemy ciphers in the darkness of the archive. The room was packed with people from every walk of life, from the high lords who had once sneered at her rags to the humble sorters and messengers from the slums who now looked up at the dais with tears of genuine hope in their eyes. Thorne turned to Aria, his golden eyes no longer burning with the fire of arrogance, but with the steady and enduring light of a deep and earned devotion. He took the silver scepter of the realm, and instead of holding it aloft as a sign of his own power, he offered it to her handle. First, an act of total and public submission to her intellect and her spirit. Aria took the scepter, her fingers steady as she stepped forward to the very edge of the dais. She began to read the new laws, her voice clear and resonant, reaching into the furthest and darkest corners of the stone arches. She spoke of the immediate and total abolition of the shadow laws, the cruel statutes that had kept the omegas of the realm in a state of perpetual invisibility and silence. She declared that from this day forward, the worth of a citizen would be measured by the clarity of their logic and the depth of their contribution to the common good, rather than the status of their birth or the strength of their alpha scent. She described the creation of the Royal Academy of Logic and Cryptography, a place where every child, regardless of their background, would have the right to learn the patterns of the world and the language of the stars. As she read, the high nobles watched in a stunned and respectful silence, realizing that the world they had once manipulated was gone, replaced by something far more stable and just. Aria felt a surge of profound and empowering peace as she realized that her trauma was no longer a heavy chain, but a solid foundation upon which she was building a sanctuary for the forgotten. She had used her long years of silence to learn the absolute truth, and now she was using her voice to speak it into existence. Thorne watched her, his inner thoughts a complex tapestry of pride and late regret for the years he had wasted in the darkness of his own pride. He saw the way the young servants in the hall looked at her as if she were a living miracle, and he realized that they did not just see a queen. They saw a guardian who would never let them be cast out again. The mating bond was now a bridge of pure and shimmering gold, a connection that was based on mutual respect and a shared goal of a better and brighter future. Thorne stepped closer to her, his hand resting gently and reverently on the small of her back, a touch that was no longer possessive but supportive of her sovereign mind. Together, they stood as equals, the sword and the shield, the power and the logic. Aria looked at the face of a young girl standing near the front row, a girl with soot-stained hands, just like her own had once been, and Aria gave her a small and knowing smile that promised a world where her mind would always be her greatest asset. The mini cliffhanger arrived as the high priest stepped forward to place the second crown of silver leaves on Aria's head, and as the metal touched her hair, a royal messenger burst into the hall carrying a scroll with a seal from the Southern Territories, indicating that the local governors were already surrendering their corrupt ledgers in fear of the new queen's logic. The Royal Archive of Cryptography was a massive and beautiful structure of white stone and dark cedar situated on a high hill overlooking the heart of the thriving city. It was a sanctuary of knowledge where the air was always fresh and filled with the scent of new parchment and the quiet, steady scratching of hundreds of pens. Aria moved through the main hall, her presence bringing a wave of respectful energy to the students who were bent over their heavy wooden desks. She saw young Omegas and Alphas working side by side, their heads bowed in focus as they practiced the art of pattern recognition and the science of logical deduction. This was the legacy she had fought for, a world where no one was invisible because of their social status, and where the mind was celebrated as the ultimate weapon of the realm. She stopped at the desk of a young boy who was struggling with a complex shifting cipher, and she spoke to him with a gentleness that encouraged him to look at the rhythm of the symbols rather than the literal letters. She saw the spark of recognition in his eyes as the logic clicked into place, and she felt a profound sense of satisfaction that she had never known in the palace. Aria climbed the winding stairs to the high balcony where King Thorne was waiting for her, his gaze fixed on the city below, where the smoke from the hearths rose into a clear blue sky. The kingdom had transformed under their joint rule, becoming a beacon of stability and progress in a land that had long been defined by the physical force of the powerful. Thorne turned as he heard the familiar sound of her footsteps, his battle-scarred face softening into a smile that was reserved only for her. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing kep, te, hat hers, in a gesture of absolute and enduring equality. "We have built a fortress that cannot be breached by swords or poison, Aria." He whispered, his voice a low and resonant rumble that carried the weight of years of shared effort and mutual healing. "The archives are full and the laws are just, but most of all the people are finally learning to see one another." Aria leaned her head against his broad shoulder, feeling the physical warmth of his presence and the steady rhythmic pulse of the mating bond that was now a source of strength rather than pain. She thought about the girl who had knelt on the cold marble floor in the great hall in shame, and the woman who now stood as the intellectual heartbeat of an entire empire. She realized that her journey was not just about the redemption of an arrogant king, but about the total empowerment of a generation that had been told they were nothing. They had built something that would outlast their own lives, a legacy of truth and transparency that would protect the kingdom from the shadows for centuries to come. The sun began to set, casting a long and golden glow across the landscape, and for the first time in her life, Aria felt completely and undeniably at home. Her mind was no longer a fortress of secrets, but a lighthouse for the future, guiding her people toward a world where brilliance would always be rewarded. She looked at Thorne and saw the man who had learned to see past the surface of things to find the fire burning in the silence. Their love was a slow burn that had been earned through logic and resilience, a bond that was now unbreakable and eternal. As the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, they'd stood together in the peace of their shared victory, ready to face whatever new patterns the future might bring. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.
Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.